have mentioned in your in your most recent report, rather, that gold has overtaken long-term U.S. Treasuries as the preferred reserve asset for much of the non-Western world, driven largely by China's strategy of pairing gold with its digital yuan to de-dollarize commodity trade. China doesn't want to use the dollar. Part of the larger de-dollarization trend that we've discussed at length in the past, using the digital yuan to buy oil, but because there's a trust issue, China has to position some kind of gold-linked settlement layer there. Now, you've said that the U.S. has recognized this shift and is now pivoting towards Bitcoin and stable coins to preserve dollar payment hegemony, and that this potentially sets up some kind of neutral reserve asset rivalry with gold for the BRICS, so China-led system, and potentially Bitcoin for the US-led system. Am I paraphrasing you correctly there?
Yeah, in essence, yeah. I mean, de facto, we can see, what we wrote, we said gold defeated long-term treasuries as a reserve asset. And that's, call up GLD over TLT on a chart. Any trader in the world can call it up, and it is up and to the right exponentially over the last 10 years. Gold won. That's can easily be seen. The U.S. has some choices. It can go with gold. To your point before, there are probably interests in the United States that see gold as giving too much to the Chinese and the Russians. And I think maybe the other issue that is within that is that gold is completely outside the dollar system, and ultimately revaluing gold a lot will move the currencies, but it's a bit of a blunt instrument. I do think the stablecoin rollout by this administration, I think they see as, in my opinion, sort of standing up Bitcoin as a neutral reserve asset for the U.S. There's people that see attractiveness to that. And I can see it too, because ultimately the higher Bitcoin prices go, you can see a very clear relationship over time between Bitcoin and stablecoin market cap. And so, there's a question around chicken or the egg of does Bitcoin go and then stablecoins or vice versa? But in the end, if stablecoin market cap goes up a lot, Bitcoin's probably going to go up a lot. And if Bitcoin goes up a lot, stablecoin market cap's probably going to go up a lot. And now we don't have to speculate. We have attached stablecoins to T-bills via the Genius Act. There's no mystery about that. And so I look at it as if I was sitting in this administration, I'd say, look, Bitcoin goes up a lot. Stablecoins are going to go up a lot. T-bill demand is going to go up a lot. And that gives me more fiscal flexibility than if gold goes up a lot as a neutral reserve asset. And that's really the angle I come at it from.
Okay, so I get the point that if you create stable coins which are backed by U.S. Treasuries, you're creating more demand for U.S. debt. That's one thing. And stable coins are ultimately what's used in, as fiat on and off ramps to get Bitcoin. But explain how that positions Bitcoin then as a potential neutral reserve asset.
I think ultimately it is when it really comes down to that relationship between the stablecoin market historically and the Bitcoin market historically, and you can see this. It's one of these things where coming a year ago, even this time, maybe 14 months ago, I wouldn't have even thought of it. June or July of last year, former Congressman Paul Ryan talked about how stablecoins could be used to help finance deficits in T-bill markets. And then I participated in a discussion at the Bitcoin conference last year where somebody who knows President Trump personally, their son told a member of that panel the night before that, Dad, President Trump, says that Bitcoin is the new oil. And at first I just thought that was a nod to the energy proof of work of Bitcoin. But then later that fall, we saw the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, the group of banks that advise Treasury, and this is in the Biden administration, this is not the Trump administration, discussing a quarterly report how digital assets can help support the Treasury market. And they specifically cite how stable coins and a market cap and Bitcoin and crypto market cap have gone up, and that ultimately that could, if paired with T-bills, create demand for T-bills. And so that's where I come out at, is ultimately, to me, it's Bitcoin. It's not crypto, it's Bitcoin. Bitcoin market cap goes up. There has been a pretty good relationship over the last 10 years between Bitcoin market cap and stablecoin market cap. And in the ensuing 6 to 8 months, we have now, passed the Genius Act. We have Secretary Bessent talking about how the Genius Act, could free up, $3.5 trillion worth of what was the phrase? It was $3.5 trillion worth of stable coins from around the world. So it starts to look a lot like the petrodollar system of where you got to have dollars to have oil. You got to have dollars to have stable coins in some way, and a lot of those dollars are going to end up in Bitcoin. Those stable coins will end up in Bitcoin market cap, is what history has shown. And so that's why I say, to me, it looks like they are quietly standing Bitcoin up to compete with gold, which has very clearly competed with and defeated Treasuries as a reserve asset.
Okay, I mean, I definitely, get the idea that the U.S., rolls out dollar-backed, supports dollar-backed stable coins, and because it creates demand for U.S. Treasuries, and, that those stable coins are collateralized with short-term government debt. I get that. And again, as we said, U.S.-denominated stablecoins are what's used most often to buy Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as the fiat on and off ramp. But then why would the U.S. actually want Bitcoin as an alternative reserve asset if the U.S. is not effectively leading in terms of Bitcoin holdings? Like, I get the gold angle because, at least on the books, the U.S. is the world's top holder of gold. And as I said, some say yes, some say more, but at least officially on the books, it's the top holder of gold. But when it comes to Bitcoin, I mean, as it stands, the U.S. is effectively starting from behind. The top holder of Bitcoin is Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he, she, they, them may be. That's also a big mystery, where he's estimated to hold, we'll go with hold between 750,000 and 1.1 million Bitcoin. But then MicroStrategy controls nearly 630,000 Bitcoin, more than any government on earth, right? By contrast, the US government strategic reserve is around 198,000 Bitcoin. China has around 190,000 Bitcoin. Again, much of it seized, not purchased. In fact, you can't trade Bitcoin in China. But the reality is that the U.S. would be positioning an asset where it's already at a disadvantage to, private companies, to BlackRock, which is the top custodian of Bitcoin, and even anonymous individuals. So how does that starting position shape the strategy? I mean, is it viable to make Bitcoin a pillar of dollar dominance when the majority of supply is elsewhere already?
In my opinion, yeah, because I think if you looked at it from a total country standpoint, so public and private holdings, I think the United States is probably the strongest holder of it in the world. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I probably should, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And in that case, then what you're really talking about doing is recapitalizing the United States, and in particular, recapitalizing them through Bitcoin holders. Now, who are Bitcoin holders? They tend to be business people who understand money, who are, they understand energy, they understand the importance of having a functioning, currency system rather than what we've had. They tend to understand Triffin's dilemma. They tend to understand all these things. And my view is these are the exact people you want to be making very wealthy through Bitcoin by revaluing and standing it up as a reserve asset. Because guess what these people are going to do? They're going to do what I am already doing, which is investing in a private equity company that is building equipment for the United States infrastructure. It's one of my bigger positions. I own a private equity investment in a electrical equipment manufacturer to make things for the U.S. Infrastructure, which is desperately, sorely needed. And so I think writ large over this country, you're going to be talking about the net producer, right? By definition, if you've got Bitcoin, you are a net producer in this society. and you have stockpiled some of your Bitcoin there, you are going to find a windfall. And what are you going to do? You're going to turn around and invest that in a productive manner. Most of these people aren't going to stick it into T-bills making 4% like baby boomers have. They're going to be looking to build business. They're going to be hiring people. They're going to be, buying companies and changing the world. So I think from a strictly sovereign standpoint, I think the numbers you lay out make sense. But I think when taken from a bigger picture perspective, I think it makes perfect sense for the U.S. to stand it up from that manner. And the other thing too is that the U.S. Ultimately, there's a fixed supply of Bitcoin. We'll take our chances. There's your fixed supply. It is a perfect hard asset over time, and that allows you to compete on the things you can compete on. Your currency is going to reflect that, but then it comes down to what's the resilience of your people, what's the resiliency and of your laws and of these things that we compete pretty favorably on.
All right. Yes, only 21 million Bitcoin can ever be created. So, Luke, you're saying that you do potentially then see a system where you have two neutral reserve assets, gold and Bitcoin.
Well, ultimately, you'll only have one, right? But to have two, you're going to have a new iron curtain between the two, and I think that's impossible for a number of reasons. And so, it's really going to come down to competition, and China and their factories, and Russia and their commodities. If they decide they want gold, then they can compete for that. But ultimately, the free market between gold and Bitcoin, it is that's where it'll be decided, right? If you are Russia and China and you reserve gold and you don't reserve Bitcoin, and Bitcoin wins, you lose.
But why couldn't there be a system where you have two reserve assets?
Just because ultimately one, without having an iron curtain that separates the two economies entirely, you'll have too much leakage, right? So one is harder than the other. One is going to be used or the other, and basically Gresham's law, right? Like you've got currency that is in circulation. Pre-1964 dimes are silver, and they're worth $3 a rattle. And post-1964 dimes are also in circulation, and they're worth 10 cents. And you can never find basically any pre-1964 dimes because everybody knows they're worth $3, not 10 cents. And in the same way, at a reserve basis, if you've got a flowing economy where you're ultimately going to want to reserve the best asset. And that's, I think we're sort of figuring out what that best asset arguably is. But it's very... multi-currency systems generally haven't worked. You had a gold and silver system, right, back in the late 1800s in the U.S., and there was constant friction around what's the ratio of gold to silver. You would have constant friction. The governments could say, well, gold is worth this much Bitcoin, or Bitcoin's worth this much gold. And at the end of the day, if you're wrong, market's going to sell the one and buy the other. Just like they do with gold and silver, just like they do with the post 1964 dime and pre 1964 dime. You'll only end up with one, whether you declare it or whether you actually do it, unless you put an iron wall and there is no more trade. China does no trade with us. The Russians do no trade with us. Oil is no longer a globally fungible market, which is, of course, in my opinion, impossible in an era of the internet.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily mean like a net zero game in terms of value, because obviously, silver still has value. Now, granted, it has industrial uses. But do you see, so you're not necessarily saying that if, say, Bitcoin becomes a neutral reserve asset, then gold becomes worthless, or if gold becomes a neutral reserve asset, Bitcoin becomes worthless?
It's a fair point. I think both can be neutral reserve assets. And I think ultimately, you would see what we've seen, right? Which is, for example, gold and silver. They're both precious metals. What's the gold to silver ratio done over the last 30 years, right? It's up and to the right. Silver buys less and less gold over time. What has the Bitcoin to gold ratio done over the last 10 years? Bitcoin has massively outperformed gold. Now, since 2021, Bitcoin's only up a little bit, and Bitcoin's volatility has been, face peeling. So there have been times where gold has been crushing Bitcoin. And that to me is ultimately, where the great contest will be when we talk about these neutral reserve assets. It's the Bitcoin to gold ratio. We saw the gold to long-term treasury ratio, GLD over TLT. For a long time in the mid-teens, it was kind of flat. And all of a sudden, gold took off. Gold has crushed treasury bonds as a reserve asset. We are flat Bitcoin to gold, Bitcoin gold ratio since 2021. Ultimately, I think Bitcoin probably outperforms over time. But again, I think the face-peeling volatility of Bitcoin is likely to continue in that time. But I think, Bitcoin, gold, and then everything else. I think Bitcoin and gold are going to go up versus virtually all other commodities, many other assets, as we move away from a debt-reserved system, as we clearly are, as we've been discussing.
Mm-hmm. But, to your point on volatility, critics would say that Bitcoin is too volatile to serve as a serious neutral reserve asset, at least for now. Why would the U.S. bet on Bitcoin then, instead of just leveraging, its own massive gold reserves to counter the BRICS gold strategy? Why not buy more gold? Also keeping in mind that, as we've discussed, central banks around the world have already effectively made their choice, at least for now, and that choice is gold.
Yeah, I think there's probably two things. I question whether central banks always have the United States interest at heart. I think that's probably one thing. And I think maybe the bigger thing is that there's one industry where the U.S. retains a real semblance of dominance, and that's tech. And in particular, the way, maybe the last great way the United States reaches the world is through this thing, right? Our iPhone and U.S. consumer tech. And so the U.S. can leverage U.S. consumer tech and tech properties around the world, tech dominance around the world, much more easily with Bitcoin than it can with gold. And I think that's probably part of the gambit as well. We'll see how it works out, but I think that's part of the gambit and logic as well.
Okay, so let me give you a hypothetical here. If I had to cryo freeze you for 50 years, and you can only put your assets, all your money in one asset. You can't touch it, you can't trade it, you just have to put it in one, and you're going to wake up in 50 years' time as refreshed and handsome as ever. What is that asset that you would choose?
Oh, God, you're going to make me piss off somebody, aren't you? If I had to choose just one, I really don't know. I can make cases both ways. The safest is probably gold. But for me, I would rather own both. I wouldn't limit myself to one or the other. I would own them both.
Sure. And diversifying is certainly a wise strategy. But if you had to choose one.
If I had to choose one, not knowing anything else, the safer choice is for most people is probably gold. It probably is. But that's such a wild card, right? If you came and said, hey, in the next 50 years, America's going to have a revolution, you need to flee, it'd probably be Bitcoin. So yeah.
But I appreciate you playing along. I won't make you squirm or have to sip any more water nervously.
Yeah, all the hate mail you're going to get me. Yeah, but yeah, it's a very difficult. I got to own both.
Yeah, and that's certainly been my position. But you mentioned technology, and so I want to bring up the idea of quantum computing because that has been seen by many as a potential existential threat to Bitcoin and the cryptography there. Granted that there are Bitcoiners addressing it, working on it, it's certainly on the radar, but how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think it's a risk. It's above my pay grade in terms of the technology of it, but the people that I talk to in that world that I really respect openly admit it's a risk. Technology moves fast. Technology moves exponentially. There are people in the Bitcoin world working on essentially using, making Bitcoin quantum proof using, in theory at some point in the future, quantum verification, quantum strengthening of the security of Bitcoin. And at the same time, like, Bitcoin's a 2 trillion market cap, maybe 2.4 trillion today. $2.4 trillion at risk from quantum. There's $18 trillion in the United States banking system just in deposits. And I would bet my house that it's easier to hack banks than it is to hack Bitcoin with quantum. So if I'm not, if I was really worried about quantum, the first thing I would do would take all my money out of a bank. And then there's $40 trillion in my 401k. Well, not my 401k, I wish. But there's $40 trillion in American 401ks. And so if quantum can break the cryptography of Bitcoin, which is very, very strong, de facto, then it probably can easily break the cryptography or the security protection of 18 trillion in banks and 40 trillion in 401ks. And, as the famous bank robber Willie Sutton said, when they said, "Hey, Willie, why do you rob banks?" He goes, "That's where the money is." So if quantum is a threat to robbing the bank of Bitcoin for 2.4 trillion, yes, it's a bearer asset and whatever, but in the end, so's cash. There's 18 trillion in cash sitting in banks. If you're worried about Bitcoin, I would argue you should be much more worried about the cash in your bank vis-a-vis quantum.
All right. If we take that similar concern as quantum potentially being an existential risk to Bitcoin, is there something that you see is the equivalent to gold? Is there a quantum computing existential risk equivalent that could challenge your position on gold?
Fiscal responsibility. An American and Western government that sells its baby boomer and voter class that we're not paying anymore, and we're going to cut spending. That's not going to happen. There have been discussions of alchemy and fusion and these types of things, and bringing an asteroid back, and there's some asteroids circling around, and Elon's going to bring it back because that's got 1.4 quadrillion of gold on it. Like, okay, yeah, and it costs like $20,000 a pound to bring stuff home from to bring stuff into out of space, right? So let's figure that out first, right? Because maybe there's a 1.1 quadrillion in gold on some asteroid somewhere, but it's going to cost you like 200 quadrillion to get it here, and that's not bad for my gold holdings per se. That's the whole point of owning gold, is the energy cost of producing it preserves your purchasing power. That's the whole point of Bitcoin. The energy cost of producing it preserves your purchasing power. So, the reason gold's worked for 5,000 years or whatever it is there's not a whole lot that breaks it. It just does what it does. It preserves purchasing power, particularly in times of insolvent governments, which is a time where we are now.
Right. But yes, to your point, gold has been around well before irresponsible fiscal policies. You mentioned Elon, Luke. It's a good way to segue into AI, which you said could wipe out a huge swath of white-collar jobs. And you said that the play there is still gold and Bitcoin. Walk us through the connection. Why do all roads lead to gold and Bitcoin, even in the face of the threat of AI?
Yeah, because ultimately we've seen, if AI does even a fraction of what its proponents and the mainstream view says it's going to do in terms of job disruption, it's fundamentally incompatible with the debt-based monetary system. What do I mean by that? You've got, the top employer in 38 out of 50 US states is healthcare. Most of that's in administration. Most of those jobs are like right in the crosshairs of AI disruption. Those people all have mortgages. Those people all have car loans. They all have credit card loans. When AI starts disrupting their jobs, and it's probably already started over the next 2, 3, 5 years, these people are going to start defaulting on their houses, on their cars, on their credit cards, just like manufacturing workers did when their jobs were offshore to China in 2001. And once that hits critical mass, the US is going to face a choice, which is, the banks are in trouble again because AI has displaced so many workers. They're defaulting on their mortgages and on their car loans and consumer loans. Are we going to print the money, or are we going to let the banks go bust? And if the banks go bust, guess what the banks are holding as their reserves in case of a crisis. We know this from 1Q23. They're holding treasury bonds. They're going to dump treasury bonds as to offset their loan loss reserves caused by AI causing job disruption. Then what? Well, then interest rates are going to go up in a severe recession, something we've never seen in the United States, but which everybody in, emerging market world sees all the time. They call it a cycle. They call it a recession. But with a U.S. government with $37 trillion in debt and true interest expense at 100% of receipts already, receipts that will be falling, you're going to have interest rates going up in a recession as your receipts fall. So the Americans are going to have to go, are we going to print the money to pay the interest and the entitlements, or are we going to default? And if we default, the debt backs everything. And so that's sort of, a version of hyperinflation. If we print the money, it's very high inflation. So your AI paradoxically is initially very deflationary, but ultimately in our debt-based system, as over-levered it is catastrophic in terms of the structure. And that's why I say all roads lead to gold and Bitcoin. Ultimately, they're going to have to print the money to make the banks whole, they're probably going to have to create some sort of universal basic income, et cetera. That's my view of it. And there are more optimistic interpretations of what AI might do. And, maybe people will, get fired from their job by AI and they'll find something else to do. A lot of people will. A lot of people won't. A lot of people won't. And the real history, when you want to be honest about it, a lot of people don't, right? Remember, learn to code. Don't worry, all these manufacturing workers, they'll find something else to do. They didn't. A million of them died of drug overdoses. And then, they were given, subprime loans to paper over their consumption until the subprime market blew up and then the economy blew up. So that's why I think AI, to me, the easiest way to play AI is just own Bitcoin and gold.
Now, when you say own gold, are we talking physical gold in this scenario, paper gold? Because I do know that you have said that holding paper gold is like holding a picture of a gun when you need it. And I love that metaphor because I thought it was very, very amusing, sadly, but very amusing. So in this particular scenario, what is the way that you suggest people hold gold? What is the way that you suggest people hold gold in general?
Yeah, all credit for that quip goes to Rudy Havenstein on X. It's his, not mine, but I just repeated it. But look, if you want to own gold, own gold. Own physical gold bullion coins. Why be wrong for the right reason? What do I mean by that is, odds are that if there's a crisis and you own some form of paper gold, that you'll get paid. But there's a risk you won't, because ultimately, it's not that the people who say they have the gold don't have the gold. They probably do have the gold. They almost certainly do. Their auditors ensure that. However, if you understand the structure of the gold market, you understand there's huge amounts of unallocated gold centered in London. And ultimately, it's not about your provider of paper gold. It's about the city of London. And there's only so much gold to go around. And if the Saudi Arabian government shows up and your paper gold vault is there, if push comes to shove, the Saudis are going to get the gold and you're going to get a, sorry about your luck, kid. Here's your cash settlement at, maybe at prior night's close. Go buy your own gold. Go buy it in the physical market. And so you might have to go buy it up a ton. It's not that you'll lose money. It's just you'll lose opportunity cost possibly. So for me, that's a tail risk, but the more extreme things get, the more extreme debt gets, the more fat tail that gets. And I don't like fat tails. I just particularly when it's so easy to remove the fat tail. You want to own gold, buy gold. Some of this, that's how I've always thought about it. Buy gold bullion.